Hey guys! Okay, so make sure that you've gone ahead and watched the other YouTube video first about dependent and independent clauses. It gives you a really good idea of the difference. So even though there's a subject and a verb in both of the clauses, you know that one can stand alone and the other one needs an independent clause to go with it to make it a complete thought. So once you watch the video and have a good grasp of what all of that means, go ahead and get out your purple grammar books and turn to page 23. So page 23 is going to be lesson 9. All right, so let's look at the gray box at the top. An independent clause is a sentence that makes sense by itself. A dependent clause has a subject and a verb, but it does not make complete sense by itself. It needs or is dependent on an independent clause. A dependent clause often begins with a word such as although, because, if, as, or when. So what I would do if I were you, before we even look at this lesson today and start working on parts 1 and 2, I would take a minute to just memorize that a dependent clause often begins with these words: although, because, if, as, or when. I would actually take a minute, maybe whether or not you're going to memorize it, at least write those words down and say dependent clause, and then under that list, although, because, if, as, when. There may be other ways that a dependent clause could begin other than those words, but for the purposes of this exercise, definitely memorize that because that's what's going to be on our test for grammar for Unit 1, okay? So definitely memorize those or at least study them, at least write them down. So go ahead and do that now. And then let's look at the top. As the wind pushes against the water, the wind creates waves. Look at the two parts of the sentence. Which part makes sense by itself? So A, the boldface part, as the wind pushes against the water, or B, the underlined part, the wind creates waves. When you say it out loud, it really doesn't even have a contest. So we know that it's the wind creates waves. Another reason we know that the first part can't stand on its own, what word does it start with? As. And so we know already that that's our hint that that's going to be a dependent clause, okay? So let's go ahead and look at part 1. Draw one line under each independent clause, draw 2 lines under each dependent clause, and circle the word that begins each dependent clause. Again, what words do you think we're going to circle? We're going to circle those 5 words. Although, because, if, as, or when. That should be totally easy for you guys. If it were me, I would go through and I would look for those keywords, and that'll give you a really big hint as to which is going to be the dependent and independent clause. So let's look at number 1. Although some people think waves are caused by tides, the wind causes most waves. So if you look at that, which word are we looking for? Although. So go ahead and circle although. And what would be the end of that dependent clause? In this case, and that's not going to be every case, but in this case, it's actually separated by a comma. So that makes it really straightforward for you guys to look for. Usually when the dependent clause comes first in the sentence, you're going to have a comma after it to separate it from the independent clause. Now, you don't want to memorize that fact because if the independent clause comes first, the dependent clause is not going to be separated by a comma. But when the dependent clause comes first, it is. So in this case, it's really easy. So the dependent clause, which we're going to underline twice, is although some people think waves are caused by tides, it can't stand on its own, right? So let's look at the part after the comma. The wind causes most waves. Can that stand on its own? Yes, it can. So we're going to underline that once because it's an independent clause. It can stand on its own. Okay. So go ahead and finish 1 through 10 on those. And then for part B, we're going to, or part B, listen to me, part 2. So it's on the next page, on page 24. So part 2. Draw a line to match each dependent clause on the left with an independent clause on the right. Then write the new sentences you created. Be sure to add a comma between clauses. Again, you're not going to add a comma if the independent clause comes first, okay? So if you start with the dependent clause, definitely add that comma. All right? Since the dependent clauses are on the left, if you start the sentence with the dependent clause, make sure you put in that comma. So go ahead and draw a line to match what independent clause would match the dependent clause. So you're going to draw lines first and then write the sentences out at the bottom of the page. So let's look at the first one. Because waves often hurl 100-pound rocks at it. Okay, so if we look at the options on the right-hand column, it looks like Tillamook Lighthouse in Oregon has steel bars built around it. Is going to be the best answer to match that dependent clause. So go ahead and draw a line from because waves often hurl 100-pound rocks at it to Tillamook Lighthouse in Oregon has steel bars built around it. And then you're going to come down where it says number 11 and has the blank and write because waves often hurl 100-pound rocks at it, comma, Tillamook Lighthouse in Oregon has steel bars built around it. Okay, so there's only 3 more sentences there, so do go ahead and write those out. Write them in cursive, please, and please use pen on the sentences just so that we can get some really good cursive practice on those, okay? If you have any questions, make sure that you either email me right then, or if you say, yeah, it's not important, or this may be a question that a lot of people may have, go ahead and make sure you write it down somewhere on the margins, even right here in your grammar workbook. So that way when we go over it in class on Tuesday, you remember, oh, Miss Bobo, I have a question about this. Because usually if you have a question, somebody else is going to have a question about it too. Okay, guys? Well, I hope you have a great weekend. Thank you. Goodbye.